Alright. Hi, everyone. So, this is our week 2 discussion, and we are talking about how the case for the Hockaday responders fits with chapter 1 and 2 from our communication course. And the first question is how communication competency applies to the case. So, communication competency involves 4 components: process understanding, which is the cognitive ability to understand a communication event; interpersonal sensitivity, the ability to perceive feelings and meanings; communication skills, which are the ability to develop and interpret messages; and the ethical component, concern for all participants and taking responsibility for communication outcomes. So I believe that process understanding, the cognitive ability to understand communication events, was used well in the case, and as well as communication skills. However, I think that interpersonal sensitivity and the ethical component were not used well. As far as interpersonal sensitivity goes, I think that without meeting face-to-face, the team members of the virtual team were not able to perceive each other's feelings or create shared meaning. I think that as far as the ethical component goes, that when Ruggiero made the decision not to provide training, that he did not really have concern for all the participants of the virtual team. He didn't realize that they needed additional training to function well as a team. And I don't think he took the full responsibility he needed to ensure a good communication outcome. Second question was how organizational communication excellence fits with the case. So organizational communication excellence is the commitment of people who are motivated to work together and share similar values and vision. I think that this is where the virtual team really failed, because they didn't have a lot of motivation to work together. They had never met, and they were more comfortable working in the formats they had already developed in working face-to-face with team members within their particular base for Hockaday. So they were used to working in local groups, and having to work in a virtual group with people they had never met resulted in much lower motivation to work as a part of that team. The next question was how communication constitutes organizations. So, communication constitutes organizations by bringing order out of chaos, it says organizations are established through communication. I think that Hockaday is a very good example of this. First of all, the organization was established through communication. Later, when Jill took over as the CEO, she communicated with Ruggiero and Jim in order to bring about necessary changes for the organization. They then restructured and tested out a virtual team, which created a new organizational structure within their organization. So I think that definitely communication constitutes organizations, and it is reflected in the Hockaday case. As far as the individual challenges that the organization faced, and that people within the organization faced, I think that the attitude of Francois, one of the members of the virtual team, in trying to take over and become the leader of the team, was problematic and caused challenges for the virtual team, and especially for Mary as she tried to lead the team. And I think also the issue with the software was another individual problem. I think organizational challenges would be introducing the virtual team. I think that by not providing training, they created more challenges for themselves because the team members didn't know how to work together in a virtual setting. And I think that not bringing the team members together to meet face-to-face was also a challenge that put the team in a challenging situation. I think that the team members could have created a lot more shared meaning had they been able to meet face-to-face and get to know each other a little better. And then from chapter 2, the first question is how the functional approach describes what happened in the Hockaday case. So the functional approach describes what messages do and how they move, and ultimately how communication produces organizational outcomes. I think the last part is key in this case, in how communication produces organizational outcomes. I would say that the communication in the Hockaday case definitely produced organizational outcomes. For instance, when Jill and Ruggiero initially began discussing changes, they decided to implement a virtual team. Later, communication was used to structure the team so that they could prevent issues with the presidential visit in Europe. And then later on, near the end of the case, communication was used to further structure the team so that they could have face-to-face meetings semi-annually and could work together better as a virtual team. They also underwent some restructuring because new team members joined and old ones left. As far as the meaning-centered approach goes, I don't think that the Hockaday responders fit very well in the meaning-centered approach, and I think that's where a lot of the problems came in for them. The goal of the meaning-centered approach is to create shared meaning through messages. I think that while they shared plenty of messages, the virtual team had a hard time creating shared meaning because they had never met face-to-face. They had a hard time working together because they didn't really know each other. They just saw, for instance, the teammates' profile pictures. They saw glimpses of them in video communication, but it wasn't a real face-to-face interaction. I think Hockaday recognized this at the end when they decided to provide an opportunity for face-to-face meetings. And then I think the 21st century perspective that fits the best with the Hockaday case is postmodernism. The postmodernism perspective is the idea that they reject former notions of authority, power, and concepts of effectiveness. So in the Hockaday case, they definitely rejected former notions of authority and power. Normally, an organization has centralized or a somewhat hierarchical structure of power, and in the Hockaday case, they had decentralized power and self-led teams. Also, the virtual structure fits more with postmodernism than with former ways of thinking. The team also functioned with a great deal of ambiguity, which is another characteristic of postmodernism. I think that Hockaday responders would do well to combine all three of those approaches: the functional approach, the meaning-centered approach, and the postmodernist approach. I think they did a good job already using the functional approach to establish and structure their organization. I think they should include more elements of the meaning-centered approach in order to establish better ways for creating shared meaning among the virtual teams. I think if they're going to continue with the virtual team structure and introduce more virtual teams, that they need to create an opportunity for those teams to meet together face-to-face. And finally, I think that the postmodernist approach can be used in how power is structured. I think that the decentralized structure of power worked very well for the virtual team, and especially in a virtual team, I think it's important to have decentralized power rather than a hierarchy or a centralized power, because then things don't flow as smoothly. And the single idea that I think would be most important to me in the case was the idea of the functional approach that says communication produces organizational outcomes. Initially, communication produced the changes that needed to be made in Hockaday, and Jill and Ruggiero's decision to test out the virtual team structure, which I think was a very wise decision to meet the needs of a changing environment. Later, communication was used to structure the team in order to prevent the same issues had happened in the U.S. from happening in Europe. And in the end, surveys were a form of communication that were used to provide a new structure for the current virtual team and future virtual teams in allowing them to have semi-annual face-to-face meetings. And to wrap this all up, I think one other important element of the case is that Chapter 1 comes from something from Chapter 1. Chapter 1 discusses communication systems within the organization, human and technological systems being important for problem solving. In order to properly use established systems, I think that training is important. So initially, Ruggiero made the decision not to provide training to the top employees because he believed they were experienced enough, but I think experience would have been important for them to properly use the virtual systems that were established. I think training could have proved very useful and could have prevented a lot of the issues that they faced later on. And that's all for this week. See you all next week.